I am so happy to have with me here today Dr. Kristen Liesch, who is a co-CEO and co-founder of Tidal Equality. She was named a Forbes Diversity and Inclusion Trailblazer many years ago. Kristen is a strategist and educator with 15 plus years of experience designing transformative curricula, implementing equitable process changes, and capacity building programs to support the design of more equitable organizations in Canada, the US, Europe, and New Zealand. Kristen is also the creator of the Equity Sequence, a research-backed method that ensures DEI efforts in the workplace have a lasting impact by filling all gaps in representation and input. So welcome, Kristen.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. I'm really excited to hear about your expertise and input on this. So Kristen has very kindly taken the time to review the case that we are talking about today. And I had some targeted questions for her to weave in her expertise as a DEI professional to provide another perspective on the broader view of domestic violence in the workplace and how all these different areas might intersect with each other. So to kick things off with our discussion, I wanted to talk about the approach that the employer took to supporting this employee in the workplace, leading up to the decision to pull the trigger, terminate for just cause, and eventually what led to this grievance. And you probably saw that in some respects, the employer really did go to great lengths to try to support this person, had suggested even a residential treatment program. But on the other hand, looking at it as a lawyer, I can see a bit of a box ticking exercise happening to support their case ultimately to show, did we satisfy our duty to inquire? Did we offer treatment? Did they say yes or no? Oh, they said no. Okay, we're done here. And then it moves over to the discipline phase. So I can see the preparation from a litigation perspective here. And I'd be interested in hearing your views as a DEI professional on what's going on here in terms of supporting the employee, what could have been done differently, anything that stood out to you as a DEI expert. Please.
Thanks for that question. No, I think to your point, on the surface, anyone takes a look at the various interventions that were proposed and offered by the employer, and you might say, well, look, they did their best. They clearly went above and beyond in what they offered. But also to your point, it was an organization first approach, as in the beneficiary of those efforts was primarily the organization, despite the fact that it was offered to the employee. And the way that we know that it was an organization specific approach is that there's no evidence over the course of the process that they engaged the employee in a way that would help them better understand more appropriate or applicable interventions for that employee in that context. And at Tidal Equality, we always talk about ensuring that you engage the people who you're intending to benefit with your intervention or program, that you engage them in the co-design of the solution to the challenge that they're facing. And so this is an approach that we can look at and on one hand say it was a little bit paternalistic. We can see in the details of the case that they didn't take into account that individual's very specific personal context, things related to pets and pet care, right up to other sorts of issues that were related to their personal life. So they provided a blanket solution, a one-size-fits-all solution, yes, albeit comprehensive, but was it one that was truly addressing the actual unique contextual challenges of that employee? Perhaps not. And it's not so different from lots of interventions or programs we create in the workplace where the decisions are made by a very relatively small homogeneous group of people that's intended to support or impact people who have different perspectives, needs, desires, and their needs go unmet, their voices go unengaged, their perspectives go overlooked. So that's what kind of stands out to me at first glance.
Right. Okay. So let's talk about some specific examples then on that subject. So I have three that stood out to me. One of them was that the employer offered to transfer the employee to another store location if the employee had asked for it. and the employee did not ask for it. And so they said, we've done our part and that's it. So what do you think about that approach and how things might have been done differently if they were being more concerned about diversity, equity, and inclusion in this case?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, as someone who is no lawyer, it was a bit perplexing to me to see that it translates as, well, we're willing to make this accommodation, but we won't offer it. We'll wait for it to be asked for, which is no accommodation at all at the end of the day. If a recipient is unaware of a potential solution and yet it's never presented to them, it might as well not exist.
Right. Okay. And so in a similar vein, I'll just turn to another example. The employer had offered to prepare a violent incident response plan, meaning, these are the steps we would take if your spouse shows up again and presents a threat. So they offered to prepare that if this individual who's dealing with the abuse at home specifically asked for it. And again, the employee did not. I'm assuming similar kind of response. Anything else to add to that on that subject?
I started the previous one by saying I'm no lawyer, and I'm going to start this one by saying I'm no psychologist, but trying to take the perspective of a person who is in this situation and knowing in my own life people who've had experiences with gender-based violence, it's incredibly psychologically complex. And to take a person in that context and expect for them to request something this procedural, and also it requires them to be at a particular point in their own engagement with their circumstances and frankness with that requires a lot of self-actualization that many people who are living in a constant state of fight or flight, freeze, fawn, etc., are just not in a position to do. So again, it doesn't take into account the employee's potential state. There's no perspective taking going on here that might help them reveal, is this an appropriate intervention to have on offer, or to even expect the employee to raise as part of something they'd want to do?
Right. Okay. And the third example that I was going to mention was offering to place the employee in a residential treatment program. Again, offered, employee said no. I'm assuming the similar lines of answer there. I think that was very helpful. Pointing out the fact that, like this individual might not even be in a place to recognize the need for support or, for various psychological and medical reasons, be in denial about needing that kind of support. So I'd like to just do a bit of a transition before we come back to this particular case, because the subject of a diversity officer actually came up in the coroner's inquest that informed this domestic violence provision in the Occupational Health and Safety Act that I've been talking about the last few days. And it struck me as interesting that the concept of a diversity officer even came up in that inquest, because it was back in 2007, I believe, which is earlier and much, well, I would think much earlier than when DEI efforts became more commonplace in workplaces across North America. So I'd like to read to you the specific recommendation that came out of that inquest and get your thoughts on how this might translate to DEI in the workplace, specifically in the context of domestic violence. So the recommendation reads, it is recommended that hospitals, being the workplace, have available the services of a diversity officer reporting to the hospital administrator, who is available to consult with and provide supportive assistance to complainants and potential complainants in relation to violence, abuse, and harassment on the part of coworkers, and including physicians. Again, the physician in this case was actually the abusive spouse as well. And the rationale for this recommendation from the jury was that, according to evidence of various members of hospital nursing and admin staff, it was beneficial to have an unbiased resource person available to present concerns. And I'd like to highlight here that there's an expansion a bit on the role of the diversity officer officer here, the initial recommendation was specifically for the survivor of domestic abuse, and then the rationale goes on to refer to the benefits of a diversity officer for colleagues who might be witnessing a coworker who's dealing with domestic violence as well. So again, this is a recommendation coming out several years ago now, and I am wondering if you have any thoughts or views on this and the role of a diversity officer for IPV or domestic violence in the workplace.
I think what I'll underscore from having heard you read that again is a supportive, unbiased officer. So we know that in all kinds of organizations, the HR function is a very legalistic type function meant to mitigate risk on behalf of the organization. And yes, according to its mandate, is meant to also support employees in access to their rights and provisions and so on. But that's not often how it's experienced on behalf of employees in an organization. And so what I hear coming from this recommendation is that individuals in a workplace, because workplaces are microcosms of society, and so they very naturally invite the same dysfunction that exists outside the walls of an organization into the walls of an organization. And what people need in that context is an individual or a group or a team that they can come to outside of the necessary mandate of an HR department, but some psychologically space, group, or individual where they can bring their concerns, their observations of discrimination, their experiences of harassment, and know that they're going to meet someone who is going to have empathy, is going to take perspective with them, is going to support them. That's what I take out of that. And I think it's interesting that what they recommended was a chief diversity officer or a diversity personnel in that era, because today that role has very much evolved to be a person in charge of programming and perhaps some policy review at the organizational level, professional development, and so on. So I would kind of put a caveat around that and say maybe in the spirit of the recommendation, it might not be today what we are thinking of in terms of a diversity officer, but it might be, do you have that function in your organization, a safe place where people can go to begin to discuss their concerns around these sorts of issues? And today we might also include in those issues observances or experiences of racism or sexism or ableism or ageism or you name it, right? Like those areas where we say something's not quite right here, but HR might not be the right place for that person to go and talk about it. Do you think that kind of sums it up?
Yeah, okay, that's helpful. And so I wanted to pick up on something that you're mentioning here. It sounds like for a diversity officer to be effective, they have to be totally independent of HR. Is that right? Generally, that's how it's set up.
I'd be cautious to make any very strict recommendations in that regard, partly because some offices are already set up to have a report into HR, for example, in the way that the structure has been made. And there are obviously, you know, as you would know far better than me, there are legal ramifications to certain types of disclosures in the workplace. But again, in terms of the role that I hear being described in this recommendation, it really is for that safe space for these issues to be discussed, aired, and so on. For it to be completely independent, there's always the risk that it also then comes with no political clout in the organization, which is also an issue we see with standard, you know, chief diversity officers, is that they are a figurehead, but they don't actually carry much weight in the executive office. So there is that issue to contend with as well. If they are just seen as a receptacle for complaints and grievances, and they have no power to affect any sort of change, that would bring with it its own kind of issues.
Right. Okay. Okay. That's an interesting point to bring up about making sure that there's a balance between independence and also having some weight pull in the organization to make sure that something happens after the fact. So I think that's helpful background to now bring it back to this initial case we were talking about and assessing the steps that the employer did, things that could be done differently, and also the role of a diversity officer. So, and and of course, looking back, hindsight is always 2020. I'm sure for the individuals working in management, it was very difficult. I have no doubt about it, for all parties involved. But again, doing a bit of a hindsight is 2020 perspective on this. In your view as an expert in the DEI world and with a lot of experience training members of management and workplaces to be set up as more inclusive. In your view, how would a more equitable and inclusive workplace have been set up in the first place to be ready to support an employee like the woman in this case?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to underscore something that you alluded to, which was the intention of the people involved in this case before I kind of address directly your question. I think you're right, and I agree that in fact, in almost all workplaces, with almost all people, with few exceptions, folks are really trying to do their best work to have their best impact to achieve the best outcomes. Like the intention is most often there. It's seldom that we have a true villain at any point, really. And so I think what this case reveals is how that intent to outcome gap occurs, right? You have the right intention, you don't achieve the outcome that you're hoping for, either for the organization, although in this case, maybe they got what they wanted, but definitely not on behalf of the employee. And so whether we take this case back to the point at which the employer began their series of interventions, or if we rewind to kind of the dawn of the organization's policies and programs being set up, what I think is an incredibly important thing to remember is that in the design of anything, we should not, cannot do it in a vacuum. From the perspectives of the people we're trying to serve. So whether this organization was setting up well in advance of this incident, a response plan to should we have an employee who is displaying these sorts of issues and is facing these challenges, and let's design an intervention. It shouldn't be done without consultation of, for example, experts in the field of domestic violence, perspectives from survivors who might be able to inform what a helpful process would look like. And in this very specific case, engaging that employee herself in designing what would the equitable supportive process look like. And organizations actually have this opportunity at every point, at just about every decision-making point, to consider their audiences, their vested parties, their stakeholders, however you want to describe them, because too often, whether we're designing a workplace policy or a program or a product for consumers, too few people with too limited perspectives and opinions and life experiences are making critical decisions that will impact a much broader, a much more diverse population. And it's in that gap that our intentions fall short and our impact isn't as great as it could be. And so my recommendation to any individual, team, or organization is, in your decision making, slow it down long enough to identify missing perspectives, unintended barriers, unmet needs, and missing voices. Solve for those by engaging the voices and co-creating together what we call equitable innovations to those products, processes, and so on, so that you can ensure maximal impact on whatever it is you're working on.
And that's really valuable feedback. And I think I could anticipate some members of management, though, raising a concern that I'm sure you've experienced before in rolling out the equity sequence, for instance, which is, sure, it's great that we identify all the different voices that might be valuable. We can even reach out to them, but at the end of the day, we can't force them to contribute to this exercise. And in this case, you and I were even discussing the fact that the employee at issue, either wasn't recognizing having a problem that could, that could be remediated by external help, or resistant to having help even if they recognized it. So, and again, I'm assuming that you've run into different examples of this in the work that you do. So what's the kind of advice you might give to an employer in this case where they say, we're trying to get the valuable invoices from people who might not usually have a voice, but they just don't want to participate?
I think that's a really great point, actually, Rika, because we, as often as I say, listen to and learn from the people who observe or experience bias, discrimination, inequality, and so on, and give them the microphone, give them the pen, let them be a decision maker. To your point, that can also be an unnecessary and unwanted burden that they shouldn't bear.
Right.
In that case, my suggestion is always to go to constellation representatives. And so who do I mean by that? Did this organization consult with a local survivorship group, a local psychologist specializing in this issue? Did they consult with, any other support groups that engage with people like this who might have insight that they can provide? Or was it primarily an exercise between the corporate counsel, HR, was that it? Because again, we can't always go direct to our most key vested party. So, and the same, and I'll make it really simple. If you're a company making a smartphone, you might not be able to go to the customer who lives in, number 7 over there, who's going to buy your phone and get their perspective.
Yeah.
But you can learn about their wants, needs, desires, opinions in other ways through other corollaries. So, I always suggest you try and take it that next step. If you can't go to the person directly themselves,
right.
A story from I read a story to my daughter last night who talks about using your gray matter. Okay, use your gray matter. Who is the next best person to talk to, right?
Yeah.
Or don't say we tried, she wouldn't talk to us,
Right.
and so myself in HR and my friend in legal, we just went ahead and we're done. Right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, no. Okay. Thank you. That's very helpful. You have a smart kid. Using your gray matter goes for all industries.
Yeah.
Okay. So that brings me to the end of my questions. I just wanted to give you a chance to add anything else, if there was something else you wanted to comment on at all on the case or this separate inquest that we mentioned. And if not, we can call it a day, but I'd like to turn it over to you one last time.
I think what I would leave with the audience is a question, and that is, who are you perhaps inadvertently leaving out of your decision making that is a key vested interest or vested party in the decision you're making? Because over the course of the last 7 years at Tidal Equality, I've watched tens of thousands of people make decisions like on our platform and in other contexts. And about 95% of the time, there is a gap there, a pretty significant gap between the decision maker and who they're making decisions for. And when people see that gap, they also see the opportunity to innovate how they do what they do to make their outcomes better. So I encourage the audience to ask themselves that question. Are you engaging who you need to engage in the co-design of your work? Because if you do, you make it so much better.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you very much for that. That's a great way to end this very important discussion. And I would love to call on you again, maybe for a more in-depth look at this issue and others in the workplace in the future. So thank you so much for your time, Kristen. I really appreciate it.
It's been a great conversation. Thank you, Rika.
Yeah, thank you.